Welcome to our fifth talk on knowing the heart of Pope Francis. And just like last week where I said, we're getting into one of my favorite themes, well, we're continuing one of my favorite themes because what we're going to talk about this week is something very practical. It's something that affects every single one of us, rich or poor, whether or not we think it does. And it is this. It's going to be the theme of wealth, of true riches. And, I think a lot of us, we get too simplistic when we read Bible passages saying, woe to you rich, and blessed are the poor, and what have you. We get very simplistic if we're not careful and start to interpret it just in political terms, sociological terms, in terms of people who have more than me, people who have less than me, or whatever. And we miss the point. So this week we're going to delve into something that is very dear to my heart, and it's also, thanks be to God, very dear to the hearts of Pope Francis and of our letter writer, the Apostle James. And like I say, James, as always, it begins with some words that are very strong. So James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, begins like this. Come now, you rich, weep and wail over your impending miseries. Your wealth has rotted away, your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and that corrosion will be a testimony against you. It will devour your flesh like a fire. You have stored up treasure for the last days. Behold, the wages you withheld from the workers who harvested your fields are crying out aloud. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous one. He offers you no resistance. Could you imagine words that would be harsher, or in a certain sense, scarier than that? Yeah. Can you imagine words that seemingly are a more direct condemnation of accumulating money? And nonetheless, it's not exactly what it sounds like. In order to dig into what is behind St. James's letter, I think we should go back to something we said right at the very beginning of this series of videos, when we were talking about the poor. We mentioned a word, the anawim. And like I say, in the Old Testament, and New Testament as well for that matter, there's this continual theme of woe to the rich and blessed are the poor. Well, what does the Bible mean when it talks about the rich? Clearly it's not just talking about people who have money, because we know that in the Bible there were plenty of people who had money that God loved, that God blessed. There were emblems of righteousness. The patriarch Abraham was an extremely wealthy man. King David was obviously very wealthy, and we know that Jesus had women followers who supported him. So simply having wealth is not the issue. When the Bible uses the word rich in a derogatory sense, it's saying something about that person. What it's saying is, you have allowed wealth to become your idol. You have made possessions, you have made money into a kind of a god. You are an idolater. And you are not capable of truly worshiping God if your true pursuit in life is wealth, if it is comfort to the exclusion of everything else. Now, that's why when the Bible talks about the anawim, we said, well, who are the anawim? The anawim are the poor people who have nobody to take care of them and who trust radically in God. You see, because they do not have the option of making possessions or wealth their God, at least seemingly they don't, they put everything into God's hands. And that's why in the spiritual life, in the biblical sense, having a lot of wealth is not a bad thing, but it is a very dangerous thing. It's a responsibility. It's a duty. And if we don't live up to that duty, then, like St. James was talking about, we're going to have a big reckoning. Jesus himself said in the gospel, "To whom much has been given, much will be expected in return." Well, it applies to all of our gifts. It applies to the man with the big intellect. It applies to the woman with the great beauty. It applies to the person with the nice singing voice. And it applies to the person with a lot of money. To whom much has been given, much will be expected in return. In the Pope's first encyclical, Lumen Fide, and the Lumen Fide is kind of an interesting encyclical. It is written kind of simultaneously by two popes. In fact, I think it may be the only encyclical that I know of that was written by two popes alive at the same time. We know that Pope Francis is the one who gets to put his name on it, but he also said very openly, the outline was already made by Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict kind of already wrote the backbone to it, and Pope Francis finished the job. He embellished it, he added some of his own characteristic. And the beauty of it is, on this theme, you see two popes with the exact same heart, with the exact same thought. So this is a thought that is relevant, is not just a Francis thing. This is the church speaking. What do the popes talk about? There's a chapter in there, a number in there that talks about wealth being idolatry. Idolatry. And what the popes say is this: the danger of wealth is when we're not careful with wealth, it becomes a source of division. It splits our heart. You see, when we tend after wealth, we start to tend after a whole lot of little things. I see a new car and I have to have it. I see a new phone, I have to have it. I see a better house than the one I already have, I have to have it. And we even start to look at people like that. Sometimes you see these businessmen with their trophy wives. I see another more beautiful woman, I have to have her. Divorce the old one, move on, because she's an object. And so on and so forth. And when we're not careful, the world starts being an arena of all kinds of attractive things that divide our attention. They keep distracting us in a million different directions, and we never really center on the one thing that's important, on God. That is also the danger, by the way, of our social media generation. There's nothing wrong with Facebook. I use it myself. But it's a danger. We waste a lot of time looking at a lot of little things that don't really matter. And what happens? They become for us, if we're not careful, our God. You know, in the Old Testament and in Jesus' preaching, he uses a word that is kind of funny. Jesus uses the word mammon. He uses the word mammon. Now, mammon is a word with a history to it. Mammon began as it was a god. It was a pagan god. It's a word from the Aramaic, which is a language that Jesus spoke. So Jesus and his apostles spoke Aramaic as their first language. Mammon was a pagan god, and he was the god of wealth, the god of possessions, who allowed material comfort. And the people who were not Jews, they were pagans. We know that they had lots of different gods. So when you wanted to pray for material well-being, you prayed to Mammon. Well, what happened? Mammon became something you put your trust in, something you put your hope in, something you put your faith in. And very slowly, the word started to change its meaning so that wealth, because the god of wealth was represented by this word, wealth itself started becoming considered mammon. It was your security blanket. It was the thing you leaned on. It was the thing you depended on in order to get by in life, in order to survive. That mammon, like we said, became for Jewish people, if they weren't careful, a rival god. It became a rival god. This is where money becomes dangerous. And that's why the Apostle James is so harsh. He says, "Weep and wail over your impending miseries, you rich." Why? Because they have money? No, that's not the point. St. James, I'm sure, had wealthy people who supported him. saying, weep and wail, because if you're clinging to your possessions, if you're putting all your security in those possessions, if they become where you find your meaning, your identity, then you had better watch out, because you're building on sand. How many of us, we find our identity in the clothing that we wear? And if I can't buy whatever the latest brand is, I feel like I'm a failure. I feel like I don't have my identity. How many of us find our identity in our hairstyles, in our makeup, whatever? We are building ourselves a false idol. Pope Francis, in our apostolic exhortation that we've been referring to so much, Evangelii Gaudium, has some very beautiful words here. Number 58 of this apostolic exhortation, of this encyclical rather. He says this following: money must serve, not rule. And then he says, the Pope loves everyone. This is Pope Francis speaking. The Pope loves everyone, rich and poor alike. But he is obliged in the name of Christ to remind all that the rich must help. They must respect and promote the poor. I exhort you to generous solidarity and to the return of economics and finance to an ethical approach which favors human beings. Now, what does he say here? Money must serve, not rule. If money was a bad thing, could it serve us? No. So obviously money by itself is good. It's a tool, as long as we don't worship it. But he says money cannot rule us, and that's the danger. So the Pope says, I love rich people just as much as I love poor people, but I exhort you, if you are rich materially, we have to use the wealth that we have as a responsibility to help the poor. That's the Pope's appeal. Does it mean give away every stitch of clothing like St. Francis did? Well, maybe, but probably not. There have been a lot of saints, usually they become monks or something, that God is called to do that. But that's not the normal thing. I'd like to propose to you another alternative, and it is this. It's called responsible stewardship. And it's something that is as old as the church. It goes way back a long time. St. Ambrose, for example, who was the person who converted St. Augustine, so we're talking way back. St. Ambrose used to speak about the fact, he says, don't just throw away your money. If you are a wealthy person and a landowner and you have estates, he says, don't throw it away. He says, learn to use it in order to create just society. Learn to use it to create new opportunities. If you're a businessman, use your wealth, use your business to create good jobs and treat your people with dignity. And from the profits that this makes, some of it can be inverted back into your business, but some of it can also be given then to charity. Because if you destroy that machine, your business, you can give away once, and then your opportunity to give is over. If you maintain the machine and it keeps producing over and over and over again, you can continue to serve the poor over and over again. That's responsible entrepreneurial charity. And that is a real option for us. So the church is not saying, like we said, that wealth is evil, only when it becomes our master. St. Louis was king of France. He basically owned France. He was a wealthy person, yes. He chose to live like a poor man, privately, but he still wore a crown. He still had to go out in his big robes when the occasion called for it, and he used his position responsibly to reach as many poor people as possible. St. Charles Borromeo, the church is full of figures who have used their wealth not for selfish motives, but as a responsibility to be a gift that keeps on giving. And this is, I think, what the Apostle James is talking about, because like we said, we know that James must have had wealthy people who helped him. This is what Pope Francis and Pope Benedict talk about in their encyclicals. Going back to our Pope Francis, true peace does not act as a pretext for justifying a social structure which silences or appeases the poor so that the more affluent can placidly support their lifestyles while others have to make do as they can. This opens up a whole other chapter. This perhaps is more telling. This is perhaps more relevant to a lot of us. It is not an option to close our eyes. It is not an option for me to be comfortable knowing that my neighbor isn't. It is not an option, using the words of Pope Francis, to placidly support my lifestyle while others have to make do as best they can. The dignity of the human person, according to Pope Francis, and the common good rank higher than the comfort of those who refuse to renounce their privileges. And when these values are threatened, a prophetic voice must be raised. So, you and I have an obligation. We have an obligation. Let's not let material possessions become our gods. Let's not let material possessions make us comfortable, because when we become comfortable, we become numb. We become blind. There's also a temptation that people who are poor can have. They can also make wealth an idol. And again, this is something we see walking down the street in Yonkers, and it's something I used to see all the time in the Philippines. The poor people can be just as materialistic as those who are materially rich. Let me say that again. A person who is financially poor can be just as materialistic as a person who is financially rich. In what sense? Well, so many times when we see people who pin all of their hopes, all of their ideals on simply getting ahead, moving up the line, getting richer, that means that they are slaves to an ideal of wealth. Their hearts are not detached. They don't have the material possessions physically, but they have them in their heart, or they want to. And they still look to those material things as the God who is going to save them, if only they can get them. So, what does the apostle and what does the church propose to us? It is this: God is God. We have one God, and let us worship Him. The church has been teaching us for years on end to pray to God, to make Him the center of our lives. And secondly, to reach out to recognize the face of God, to recognize the face of Christ in my neighbors who need me. As long as we are men and women who have that intimate life of union with God in prayer, and as long as that intimate life of union with God in prayer reaches out to extend itself to those who need me, we know that we are worshiping the true God. So let's beware of worshiping the God of Mammon, and let's always stay close to the God who loves us.